Hello and welcome to another Melbourne AWS user group, here from my very own office / spare bedroom. I think we're up to episode 94 now. Man, time flies. We're up to 7 years of this, so hopefully we don't have to do too many more in isolation and we can get back to our regular events soon. But I won't keep talking for too long. Quick look at our agenda tonight. We have the introductions, which is the bit I'm doing now. We have a quick what's new presentation or discussion from Ian and friends coming up straight after this. Dawn is back again to talk to us this time about Control Tower, which is really good because I haven't used Control Tower before, so I'm looking forward to this one. And then Mohan will be taking us through implementing EKS after the break, as in the very, very short break, because I didn't have time to put together an intermission this month. So we're wrapping up a little bit earlier than normal tonight, and then we'll have the usual post-Zoom social session after this. For more information on that, jump on our Slack. Hello. There we go. One too far. Way one too far. Let's try this again. There we go. So the format for tonight, we have 2 presentations. After each presentation, there is an opportunity to have your questions answered. You can ask questions by joining our Slack team and asking in #Melbourne or #General or wherever you feel like, really. On Twitter using the AWS Melb hashtag, or right in the YouTube channel where you're watching now. So at the end of each presentation, Ian or myself will ask the questions of the presenter on your behalf. So it's a good chance to get them answered. We welcome comments and feedback throughout the event as well. Any comments that you want to leave via those same channels, if they're good, we may incorporate them into the show. As always, we can't do this without our sponsors. And for the second year in a row, Enable has been our gold sponsor. So we're very grateful to them for their assistance. We also have a new silver sponsor in the ranks for the rest of this year. Do It International has joined AC3 and CMD, and we're very grateful for their support as well. So a little bit of who we are. Something that we usually get asked a fair bit is what role Ian and I have with Amazon Web Services. The answer is none. We don't work for Amazon Web Services. We're just members of this community, the same as you. The good thing is with that we don't have to talk nicely about Amazon all the time if we don't feel like it. We're more than happy to call things as we see it, and we share and welcome the community to do the same. If you want to be a little bit controversial and say that Azure is better at some things, by all means. We're not here to stop that or judge that. If you want to get involved in the conversation, you can join our Slack team at the URL on the screen there. We have a whole bunch of channels, but it's a really great place if you're looking for work. There's a jobs channel there, or if you're looking to hire people. We have a channel for volunteers as well, if they want to get involved in running these events and the group in general. We have channels for outages and we have channels for announcements. These just based off general discussion around feeds, but generally they're pretty good. So yeah, jump on Slack. It's a great place to ask questions for tonight as well. I believe both presenters will be on Slack after this as well if you want to ask them any questions directly. If you do want to get involved in helping out, we're always looking for speakers. Finding speakers is probably the most challenging part of running these events. Our sponsor roster for this year is now full, but if you're looking to sponsor, we're open for sponsors for next year. And we're always looking for volunteers. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into running these things, so many hands make light work, as they say. So if you do have some time that you'd like to contribute and help out, we're more than welcome. Jump in the volunteers channel on our Slack. So just a quick reminder of the events that are coming up. This Friday, 2 days from now is the first serverless community day, hosted fully online. It sounds like they've just made the move to Twitch, so hopefully it won't have the same problems that the summit did. Pretty sure Twitch can handle Melbourne Community Day traffic volume, so I don't think we've got anything to worry about there. There's the URL at the bottom here. Just a short link to go to the registration page. I believe it's still open, the online event after all. Following on that, 2 weeks later is the Melbourne Community Day, or the Australia-New Zealand, Community Day. Again, another online event, 2-day event this time. So that should also be really good. The lineup for these that are coming out now is looking really, really solid. Definitely worth attending if you can get the day off, or even just keeping it open in a window. The boss will never know you're working from home. A little bit more local, the Programming and Tools meetup. Scheduled their next one today or yesterday. This time they're looking at coordinating code commit, and step functions using the CDK for multi-pipeline releases. That's a mouthful. But it should be really good though. They generally run really good sessions, and we get hear a lot of good things about these ones. So you should definitely check that out. And I think that's all I have as far as slides go. So we'll throw over to Ian and friends for the news. Sorry about the audio issues, everyone. Just fixing them up now.
Yeah. Okay. Welcome back. I hope everybody can hear me now.
Hi, everyone.
It's all good. So let me just wait until we are sure by seeing YouTube catch up. Somebody can say something there. Yeah, cool.
Oh, cool.
Excellent. No, we did not coordinate backgrounds, guy.
Great guy.
So finally in Sydney, the things from Sydney, the services that have just come to Sydney that were not there before. So these two were released, or three, I would say actually, were released a day or two after our last meetup. It's the RDS Data API, which allows you to call to your Aurora cluster using a REST API instead of SQL queries, and the Query Editor, which allows you to run your queries from within the console. More interesting, perhaps, is the RDS proxy. Do you want to talk about that one?
Instead of using ODBC, basically you can do a HTTP endpoint with the SDK, and you have a call out of 45 seconds. So that's simplify a lot the type of communication you can have with your database, and you don't need to install anything to the Aurora serverless. So I like that. And the RDS proxy, it's still in preview here in Australia with the new region. And I like it because it's really help you to buffer your connectivity back to your RDS and act as a proxy, and that allow you to have a very fast failover as well if one of your RDS database goes down. So good product and good preview. I recommend to try to join that preview.
Yeah, definitely happy to get that one. And it's very good with your Lambda functions. So speaking of Lambda and serverless, let's switch to that part. With big news
that's a big
for
one.
Lambda.
Yeah, big one with EFS for Lambda. That's very interesting, isn't it, Arjun? That becoming serverless, but still with state and data.
Yeah. So some big use cases around this are obviously in the machine learning space, where you tend to have a lot of data that you need to have your functions process. But I read an article by Pete Sparsky, who also implemented this for a video transcoding example or application he built purely in Lambda. From what I read in there, he will actually be presenting about that on Friday, so I definitely recommend checking that out to see a good use case for this.
Yeah.
So
the Lambda function can be in the different account. That's pretty cool, and it can be mounted through different VPCs as well across peering. And obviously, it's encrypted. He'll mount the EFS into the same availability zone the Lambda is running, so that saves you the transfer cost. And with TLS, but it takes a few hundred milliseconds to mount that EFS, so don't expect a very fast call start for your Lambdas.
Yeah, but it's better than not having the option at all.
Oh, of course, yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So some other cool stuff here. We're not going to dwell on these things too much because we've still got lots of other things to go through. SAM support for step functions. So you can now build your step functions in SAM. If you're using that, it might be slightly more compact to write it than in pure CloudFormation. And the code pipeline support for step functions, I think that Rob just mentioned that is coming up in a programming tools meetup. So if you're interested in that one, I'd say go and watch Guy explain it all to us.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Looking forward to that, Guy.
And one especially for Rob here at the bottom, the Swift Lambda runtime.
Woohoo!
There were actually sessions for this at WWDC. So this seems to be supported by Apple. If you run your Swift applications, you know how to do it.
Yeah, so Swift was developed by Apple in 2014 for iOS and iPad and macOS and watch and TV. But now it's version 5.2 since March, and small footprint, small memory, so that fits perfectly with the Lambda, right?
Yep. Cool. Let's have a look at containers. I know this will be mostly me talking, but for me, the big one probably is Fargate now has the ability to encrypt ephemeral storage by default. Always good. And
that gives you 20 gig of storage, and then now it's encrypted with IES 256. So, you know, for financial organization who need to encrypt data, that's pretty good to have that.
Yeah. And if you use AppMesh, the controller for that for Kubernetes is now GA, so that's good. And the new one instances, they were announced at reInvent last year. You can now run EKS on them as well, which is good if you're doing a lot of data analytics or AI/ML type stuff, because that's what they're optimized for.
It's supported with self-managed node groups only, and you can run obviously TensorFlow, PyTorch, and MXNet with EKS cluster version 1.14. Quite expensive in one, so you need to know what you're doing, but they're still cheaper than the G4, so that's pretty. Apparently, they're 40% cheaper than the G4 in cost performance comparison. So it's good.
Cool. On the DevOps side, another big announcement: Code Artifact.
You like the name? I'm sure you were complaining about the artifact problem in AWS in the past. Code Artifact now is a good name, is it?
It is definitely a good name. I still think there will be some confusion with Artifact.
Yeah.
But for those of you who don't know, Code Artifact is a package storage solution similar to things like Nexus or I'm blanking on some of the other names.
JFrog Artifactory?
Yeah, those things.
Yeah.
So it's awesome as a managed service. I haven't tried it out yet in Anger, so I can't say how good it is. Might suffer a bit from some of the usual just out of the box or just freshly released things, but definitely something to look forward to.
Yeah, you can have NPM store, PY store. You can encrypt with KMS with CMK, so that's pretty good. Use your own keys, and apparently CloudFormation support coming very soon. So that's good.
Yeah. Also, two things for CloudFormation that I quite like. First is that you can now that the resource import function supports registry type CloudFormation. The CloudFormation registry, if you don't remember, is where you have the ability to create your own resource types, and deploy those. So that, and now you can use that to import existing resources as well. That's nice. The other one is an open source project, CloudFormation Guard. Still early stages, but the idea is that you can use this to verify whether a CloudFormation template complies with your organization's standards.
So yeah, AWS used to use CFN NAG, which is done by the consulting firm in the US, and now they're releasing that CFN Guard, which does a bit the same thing, but you set up your own policies. So that's interesting. Good product. I think everyone to want to commit code who has been verified before they get committed, right?
Yep. Cool. On the security side, then, also a couple interesting one. SSO now integrates with Okta, which basically means that if you or your organization use Okta, you can now pass the AWS account access part of it to AWS SSO, which might make that a bit nicer looking than just the usual here is your roles that you can choose from. SSO,
it does provide as well a scheme, which is the system cross-domain identity management. So your user get created automatically inside SSO, and SSO we know suffer from having no API. So that's pretty good automation. You create the user in Okta, they appear in SSO automatically.
Yeah, and a couple of big updates for AWS config as well. I know you really like config, Jim. So
yes, config rules. So you can now have a different account to push instead of using your master, which is not the best practice, but using a different account to push your config rules management pack, and then 9 new managed config rules, a bit on Security Hub, S3, EBS encryption, DynamoDB encryption, just to verify that you do the right thing with the product. So a couple of new managed rules done by AWS that serve us to do Lambda function instead. That's good. And the last one, backup with Aurora, was just support for Aurora. I didn't know that was not supported before, but so now AWS backup can backup EBS, RDS, and Aurora, Dynamo, EFS, EC2, and storage gateway volumes.
Yep, it's expanding all the time, which is always good.
Yeah.
So some other cool stuff. We've got snow cones. Basically another entry into the snowball family. Instead of a truck this time, it went smaller, about the size of a shoebox, I think it is.
Yeah, it's kind of A4 folded. So you have a A4 page, you fold it in half, that's 23 by 15 by 8, a bit thicker, like a takeaway containers. It's 2.1 kilo, which is quite light to ship around. It can be powered with batteries with 6 hours, and you have 8 terabytes of data. You can have Ethernet 1 gig, 10 gig, Wi-Fi. There is 2 CPU, 4 gig on it. You power that with a USB-C power. So it's it can fall from 1.5 meters as well to the ground and kind of rugged, and obviously it's encrypted. But it's only in the US. Not to try, yes. It can operate between 0 and 38 degrees as well. So it's quite strong, but only US Virginia at the moment and US West Oregon. So we can't order one right now from Sydney.
Yeah, maybe once the borders open up, they can be shipped here.
And so you can copy data back to S3. I mean, it's the same as any snowboard. You can back data back to S3, to EFS, or to FSX Windows file server. So for migration or small, capture of data, that's a good product.
Yep. Cool. And for those of you who like Deep Composer, there are now competitions for that as well. I haven't looked at it yet. Too close.
Yeah, competition is with Sebastian Bach, the classical music, so Back to the Future, and it's from June 22 to July 21st. And you can join. It's a bit like to show your AI stuff. And they have a special at the moment. You can buy the keyboard for $79 to join the competition, and 3 months of free trial. So I don't know. Guy is not here, but I'm not a fan of music, so I won't join. But that could be interesting for AI purposes.
Yep. Direct Connect failover testing. That seems like something that was a bit overdue.
Yeah, people were doing it from on-prem with failovering router before they for testing before they were moving any production data in there. But now AWS provide a console or a CLI command to be able to do that from the AWS side, and with a resiliency kit, and to be able to do that, and you can fail over a BGP session. And AWS keep the test history for 365 days, so you can go back and say I've done testing every month. So it's just an add-on tool that can help to fail over. Yep. You like the C6? I'm sure the new Graviton instances, Arden?
All the Graviton instances, it's just interesting to have all the ARM stuff. Unfortunately, again, not in Sydney.
Yes, only US and Frankfurt and Tokyo, not yet in.
And similarly, the AMD instances with the 2nd-gen EPYC, the C5A, it feels weird to see both C5s and C6 released, but the C6, as far as I understand, are really reserved for ARM.
Yeah, it's true. They have the G name, yeah. But you can run a lot of stuff. I was looking at the list, and you can run, Red Hat, Ubuntu, SUSE Linux, Fedora. You can run ECS, EKS, all sorts of things with the C6 instances. So I think they're going to be more and more in use, and you can go from one CPU to 64 CPU. So that's going to be interesting. 40% more performance than an M5 at the same price cost. So very interesting.
Definitely. Cool. And with that, I think we'll leave it to our main speakers. Just shout out, as always, we will be recording a podcast version of this together with a guy who is talking too much on this chat. And, yep. And then let's go to Rob.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, guys. So up first tonight we have Dawn. Dawn has recorded us another presentation again She's a regular contributor now to the Melbourne AWS user group, and really thankful for the effort that she puts into these presentations. So without further ado, we'll throw her over to the great introduction, I hope, to Control Tower. Looking forward to this one.
Good evening. As always, it is a pleasure to be here tonight at the AWS user group to give this talk on one of AWS's new services, Control Tower, which will allow you to build your AWS organizations and security framework from the ground up. I would like to begin tonight by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land I'm recording. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. Their sovereignty was never ceded, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Some of you probably have met me, some of you may not have done. If you haven't met me, you would want to know, who am I? My name is Dawn E. Collett. I am an Associate DevOps/SRE at MYOB. I have worn both hats, and my aim when I start work on Monday is to improve the systems that I work on by close of business Friday. Doesn't always happen, but I try. Outside work, I am an occasional author and kitchen alchemist. Sometimes that goes well, sometimes it doesn't. I am also a raging sports ball fan, which is why that picture of me is me at Marvel Stadium. So, in order to actually dissect how AWS Control Tower works, we're going to look at a hypothetical use case. I would like you to meet ProductCorp. ProductCorp is a hypothetical product company startup with a head office in Sydney. They were founded about 5 years ago and they offer two products. The first one is a managed inventory platform software as a service called Buy It. The second one is a managed online shopping platform called Sell It. And most importantly for their talk, all of their infrastructure runs on AWS. This is Ben Nguyen. They're ProductCorp's lead cloud engineer. They've got 10 years of experience mostly working for startups, and part of the reason that they took this job at ProductCorp is because a lot of the infrastructure at ProductCorp is immature and somewhat outdated, and they're very passionate about being able to get in and improve infrastructure. So when Ben arrived at ProductCorp, what they found was a bit of a mess. ProductCorp had just 2 AWS accounts in one organization. They had one account for all their dev services and one account for all their prod services. And I'm guessing most of you probably know why that's a bad idea. If you don't, roughly look up the principle of least privilege. Basically, the idea is you don't want multiple services running in the same account if you can avoid it, because you want people to have access to the minimum possible number of things. That means if you get hacked, then attackers potentially only get access to one product's data as compared to 2 products' data. And they do currently have some basic detective guardrails set up using service control policies, but their guardrails are not very mature. As far as actual account access, they manage all of their access using IAM users, which is not great for an organization of that size, but we'll come back to that. What's worse is that they don't require 2FA, so that means that as long as you get the username and password on those IAM users, you can go in and do whatever you want. The security guardrails that they do have are fairly immature and are mostly restriction-based. And very importantly for this, they don't use proactive security services like Guard Duty. Now, Guard Duty is not directly related to the sort of content of this talk, but it comes back to a theme that we'll talk about a bit later. So Ben sits down and they produce a plan for what they think that ProductCorp's AWS services could look like. They obviously have a great concern about security, and they think that the actual organizations can be structured better. So they build this plan and they take it to Annie Jones, who's ProductCorp's CFO. She originally worked for an auditing firm, and as the CFO, her primary focus is value for money. The CTO has signed off on this plan, but she doesn't really know a lot about security, so she doesn't understand the value in it. Basically, the way that Ben sells it to her is by explaining that it's going to be a lot cheaper for them to sort out security now than it is if they potentially get hacked down the line, where they could open themselves up to fines and reputational damage. So Annie, upon hearing that, hires Murray Novotny to be ProductCorp's new security function. She came from a consulting organization that tended to work a lot with bleeding edge AWS services and was very much at the forefront of using new AWS services to improve security and governance practices. She also holds multiple AWS security certifications. So Ben and Murray sit down together and they form a plan for the first phase of how they think they can improve ProductCorp's systems. Rather than just having one OU, they're going to have four. They're going to have a production OU, a pre-prod OU, a dev OU, and a lab OU, and restrictions on those will all be set up differently. There's going to be an individual prod or pre-prod account for each of ProductCorp's services, which will eventually be migrated as the development teams complete migration from the monolith application to one AWS account per microservice, and all the AWS accounts will talk to each other. There will be individual dev accounts for each microservice that the teams are currently working on, and one lab account per team to allow them to spike out things that they might want to try. Now, while Murray was working as a consultant, she worked a bit with AWS Control Tower, which is a service that was recently released to general availability and very recently, like earlier this year, enabled in Sydney. What Ben and Murray plan to do is to manage their entire AWS organization using Control Tower, which will allow them to provision new accounts using Account Factory to ensure that guardrails are applied. It will allow them to, or Control Tower will enforce those guardrails on OUs for them so that they don't have to do it themselves by setting up SCPs. And they're also going to take advantage of Control Tower's strong recommendation to set up single sign-on and move away from IAM users to use AWS SSO. Once they've got all of the basics out of the way, they're going to leverage that basic security posture to also lean more on proactive security services such as CloudTrail and GuardDuty, which will make them aware when there's potentially an unauthorized intrusion into their accounts. Now, this is not related to Control Tower specifically, but it's something that I think Control Tower allows you to do, is to not worry about the basics of security and use those basic guardrails that you have to then focus on leveraging those to basically create more of a proactive security posture. And now that they've developed this plan, they are going to go away and actually perform the migration. At the start of the migration, this is what their AWS organizations look like. It's fairly basic. Obviously, those are not real email addresses. They're test email addresses that I've used for this, and I've blocked them out for that reason. But they have their one master payer account, and then they have an account that has all of their production services and all of their development services. The first step for them is to go in and deploy AWS single sign-on, because as soon as you do that, you remove an awful lot of security holes. Now, Control Tower will prompt you to do that as part of the setup process, and if you're not using some kind of SSO already, like if you're using IAM users actively to access your accounts, that's something you really should be doing. Once they've done that, they're going to go into their newly provisioned AWS SSO using their accounts and enroll the master payer account in Control Tower. What that means is that any new OUs that they create through Control Tower will start with all of the mandatory guardrails enabled, and that they can now create new accounts using Account Factory to enroll them directly in those OUs. So this is what the setup screen for Control Tower looks like. It's fairly simple. There's a bit of a blurb at the top which explains some of the basics. Now, for anyone who's not seen a talk by me before, I do use a zoomed in screen setting, so I apologize for the fact that there's going to be information missing and a lot of information that's split across multiple different slides. I don't really have a way to avoid that. But you have a brief explanation of the pricing in the home region. We'll come back to the pricing, but Control Tower itself doesn't actually cost you any money. It's the services that Control Tower provisions are what you need to be concerned about in terms of the pricing. The reason that we're using US East as the home region for this demo is that I have other things deployed in these AWS accounts, so that's the region that my SSO is set up in. Then you'll be asked to provision a couple of shared accounts. Now, obviously, the master account is the master payer account. You will not be able to change that. But you'll also be asked to provision a log archive account and an audit account. The log archive account is where all of the information that Control Tower, all of the logs of Control Tower's APIs, all of the logs of resource configurations will go straight to that log account in an S3 bucket. The audit account is quite important because it's basically an account that allows your security and governance teams to assume a read or write access in other AWS accounts with an audit trail. So you don't need to give your security and compliance teams access to all of your AWS accounts if you're using Control Tower. They can assume that access through the audit account when it's necessary. So if there's an issue with compliance, Mari can go in and have a look at one of the AWS accounts, and Ben will still be able to follow what Mari has done using that audit trail. Then you'll be given a brief description of the permissions that Control Tower needs to set everything up. A lot of those are very basic around needing to actually be able to set up resources using AWS config and using the service control policies. But if you do want to use Control Tower, make sure that you do take a look through those. It's out of the scope of this talk to really go into, but it's an important thing to know what AWS is actually deploying. Then Control Tower will create two OUs for you automatically. The first one is the core OU, which contains the log archive and audit accounts that you have to create by default. That is managed by Control Tower. You can't and shouldn't touch it. The other one is a custom OU, which contains user-created AWS accounts. Obviously, you can have more than that. They're just giving you something to start with. And then if you do want to create new OUs that are enrolled directly in Control Tower, you need to do it via the landing zone page. Any OUs that you create using the AWS organizations page that you might be used to will not be enrolled in Control Tower, and at the moment you won't be able to enroll them. So if you want to enroll a new OU, you need to do it through the Control Tower landing zone page. This is what that looks like here. As you can see, Ben and Mari have already created some of the OUs that they'll want to use. And in order to create another one, they just click on the orange button with the Add an OU text on it, which will bring them effectively to a dialog box that just asks them to put in a name. As far as actually provisioning guardrails, provisioning elective guardrails and strongly recommended guardrails is not something that you do here. You just set up the OU with a name. And once Ben and Mari are done provisioning all of their OUs, this is what it looks like. The legacy OU is going to be where they're going to enroll their existing AWS accounts. So when they actually provision new accounts, adding accounts directly to Control Tower is handled by the account factory. Now that holds for both new and existing accounts, so it's exactly the same process. So let's look at one of the new accounts that they create. This is the production account for the Buy It service. You pretty much just have to give an email. You have to provide a display name for the account, which in this case is Buy It. You do need to designate at least one SSO user that has access to the account. I haven't done that because that will vary depending on how your SSO users are set up. But you will need to provide that information. And then obviously you select the organizational unit that the account is enrolled into. And that account will provision automatically with all of the guardrails on that OU enabled. Now, provisioning of Control Tower itself takes about 60 to 90 minutes. Provisioning of the individual accounts took, I think, between 3 and 10 minutes for me. But you're able to monitor the process of account provisioning through the actual, I believe this is the service control policy dialog. It's not one that I'm super familiar with, but you can go in here. It will explain to you what is actually going on as you provision the product, and you'll be able to see a description of what's going on. The in progress text, once you're done, will change to completed. Now, Control Tower also has Lifecycle Events, which record the actions that Control Tower carries out. They basically just show a success or failure state, and you can use them for automation. So they are picked up, they're accessible via API. If you want to then, once an account is finished provisioning, say, upload some things to an S3 bucket, you can do that programmatically. And those Lifecycle Events are sent to CloudTrail by default. Now, I mentioned that I use a zoomed in screen. I'm not actually going to show you what the CloudTrail for this looks like because AWS's UI for that is so poorly designed that I actually can't see any of the information on it. So if you do want to find out more about that, go and check it out yourself. Then Ben and Mari sort of perform the rest of the security audit. They clean up the old IAM users, ensure that they've got guard duty enabled, go and check to make sure that CloudTrail is actually receiving Control Tower's lifecycle events, and also enforce some extra detective guardrails on the legacy account OU during the migration process. So what they're basically doing here is they're leveraging the basic security posture that Control Tower gives them to be able to delve a bit more into proactive security. So when you want to enable guardrails, you have to actually, rather than enabling them by OU, you have to actually go into the Guardrails tab in Control Tower and then select the guardrail that you want to enable. In this case, we're going to enable the guardrail to disallow public access to RDS database instances, which you can do then just by basically selecting the OU that you want to enable it on and hitting the OK button at the bottom of the page, which you can't see because of the Zoom screen. Now, a few days after Ben and Murray have finished setting all of this up, we meet Fred Watson. Fred Watson is a US-based black hat hacker, and he wants to get into the ProductCorp databases to steal customers' identities because he's heard that their security is very poor. He's also quite lazy, so a lot of the tactics that he's going to use in his attempt to get access are fairly standard tactics that you would see from fairly low-level hackers. Last time I gave a talk like this, someone told me that they were disappointed that I didn't get an actual hacker into it. So this time I'd figured that we'd get an actual hacker into it, and we'd see how well Control Tower manages to foil him. So, round one. Fred bought some leaked credentials from one of ProductCorp's old IAM users, which were leaked by a disgruntled employee, from the dark web. And he attempted to use those credentials to access ProductCorp's AWS accounts. However, because Murray cleaned up the old IAM users as part of the security audit, Fred's attempt to get into the account fails. Round two. Fred also ran a small spear phishing campaign to get access to some credentials for some of ProductCorp's RDS databases. Now, he attempts to use those to get into one of the production databases, but what he finds is that because Ben and Murray enabled strongly recommended guardrails that enforce encryption on RDS instances and made sure that all of their RDS instances in the legacy OU were in compliance, his attempt fails. For round three, Fred goes back to our old friend S3, which is probably one of the most insecure services that AWS runs. In the legacy production account, he locates a public S3 bucket and attempts to download files from it. Now, the detective guardrails do tell ProductCorp that this is a security issue, but because they haven't finished following up on the recommended actions yet, Fred's attempt to get in and download information succeeds. He downloads basically a list of some information about staff that are working on migrating Celit from monoliths to microservices. However, because Guard Duty is set up to record security events, Guard Duty records Fred's IP address. So when Ben and Murray get back to the office on Monday morning and they notice that there is a large warning saying that someone from the US has accessed this bucket outside hours, they go in and have a look at what's actually going on in the bucket. Now, we can see that there's the text file of stuff, access data. There's also an image called hacked, and when Ben and Murray open that up, they come across this old chestnut, which anyone who saw my talk on Amazon Inspector will probably remember. So they have their PIR, and they publish a notice explaining basically what happened, how they identify it, and how they're going to remediate those security issues. But what's worth noting here is that the information that Fred obtained from that public S3 bucket was actually very limited. Had he been able to get in through the IAM user, which was disabled, or the RDS instance, which was encrypted, the damage would likely have been a lot more extensive. And that sort of illustrates what Control Tower does, in that because it gives you a basic security posture, you can then focus on closing some of those more.
Hello, I think we're back. Just waiting for YouTube to come back. Sorry about that, everyone. We had my video encoder crashed, so that's not a good thing. It says we've got... Yay, we're back up. All right, I'll bring the presentation back up. Sorry about that again.
He's also quite lazy. So a lot of the tactics that he's going to use in his attempt to get access are fairly standard tactics that you would see from fairly low-level hackers. Last time I gave a talk like this, someone told me that they were disappointed that I didn't get an actual hacker into it. So this time I'd figured that we'd get an actual hacker into it, and we'd see how well Control Tower manages to foil him. So, round one. Fred bought some leaked credentials from one of ProductCorp's old IAM users, which were leaked by a disgruntled employee, from the dark web. And he attempted to use those credentials to access ProductCorp's AWS accounts. However, because Murray cleaned up the old IAM users as part of the security audit, Fred's attempt to get into the account fails. Round two. Fred also ran a small spear phishing campaign to get access to some credentials for some of ProductCorp's RDS databases. Now, he attempts to use those to get into one of the production databases, but what he finds is that because Ben and Murray enabled strongly recommended guardrails that enforce encryption on RDS instances, and made sure that all of their RDS instances in the legacy OU were in compliance, his attempt fails. For round three, Fred goes back to our old friend S3, which is probably one of the most insecure services that AWS runs. In the legacy production account, he locates a public S3 bucket and attempts to download files from it. Now, the detective guardrails do tell ProductCorp that this is a security issue, but because they haven't finished following up on the recommended actions yet, Fred's attempt to get in and download information succeeds. He downloads basically a list of some information about staff that are working on migrating Salad from monoliths to microservices. However, because Guard Duty is set up to record security events, Guard Duty records Fred's IP address. So when Ben and Murray get back to the office on Monday morning and they notice that there is a large warning saying that someone from the US has accessed this bucket outside hours, they go in and have a look at what's actually going on in the bucket. Now, we can see that there's the text file of staff access data. There's also an image called hacked, and when Ben and Murray open that up, they come across this old chestnut, which anyone who saw my talk on Amazon Inspector will probably remember. So they have their PIR, and they publish a notice explaining basically what happened, how they identify it, and how they're going to remediate those security issues. But what's worth noting here is that the information that Fred obtained from that public S3 bucket was actually very limited. Had he been able to get in through the IAM user, which was disabled, or the RDS instance, which was encrypted, the damage would likely have been a lot more extensive. And that sort of illustrates what Control Tower does, in that because it gives you a basic security posture, you can then focus on closing some of those more obvious security holes. As far as pricing goes, as I mentioned earlier, Control Tower itself is actually completely free. What you pay for are the services that Control Tower uses to perform its task. So Service Catalog, which is used for the detective guardrails, costs you $5 per month per account factory portfolio, and each account then gets 1,000 free API calls per month. After that, it costs a very, very small amount of money, which I'm not going to attempt to read per API call. Now, they'll add up, so do make sure that you understand how the pricing works, but it's not particularly expensive. Running config, it costs you 0.3 cents per configuration recorded in config. And then for every resource that you provision, it's evaluated against rules. And pricing for the rule evaluation starts at 0.1 cents per evaluation per region, and it has tiered discounts based on volume. There are some additional charges in terms of the charges for CloudTrail log ingestion and insights, charges for CloudWatch metrics, and charges for the log archive buckets, the S3 buckets in the log archive account. But if you want to understand those charges more extensively, I would recommend that you check the pricing examples page, because it's very hard for me to break down in a talk. Now, as you may have sort of gathered from what we've been discussing here, Control Tower is bleeding edge software. And while that comes with some advantages, it comes with some disadvantages as well. In terms of current constraints, one of the things that I think will be on the roadmap for Control Tower is to be able to customize guardrails, which is something that you can't do at the moment. Because if you can add in custom SCPs to develop your own guardrails, that is going to make the utility of Control Tower much greater, because it will mean that you no longer have to provision that manually using SCPs. You can't have multi-level OUs at the moment. Now, this would potentially be an issue if you wanted to have, say, your prod OU, and then once everything is migrated over to microservices, they wanted to have an OU for buy it and an OU for sell it. Currently, you can't do that. That's another thing that my expectation is that's going to be on the roadmap in the next 6 to 12 months. So it may not be a concern for you if you're looking at using it in the future, but it is at the moment. One of the things as well with Control Tower is it kind of locks you into ClickOps because it doesn't actually have an API. So there's not a lot that you can do with it programmatically. So if you're working in a very mature institution, which does a lot of programmatic and API work around AWS, this is probably not going to be a great solution. The one which kind of interested me is that migrating existing accounts into Control Tower isn't totally seamless. There were a couple of accounts when I was testing this that no matter how hard I tried, I could never get in because I was getting unknown errors. I'd imagine that'll be fixed fairly quickly, but if you're planning on doing this now, it's something to be aware of. So, when should you use Control Tower? Even though it's a fairly new service, I think there are already a few really compelling use cases for this. One of them is sort of the use case of ProductCorp that we've looked at, which is an immature organization that's in the process of scaling everything up. Because if you can delegate a lot of that basic security to Control Tower, you can then get in and do a lot of the proactive security work around enabling guard duty, possibly more advanced SCPs, without having to worry too much about the basic things. Another use case that I think is quite compelling, even if you do have a larger portfolio, is during a significant restructure. Because if you're rearranging a lot of the accounts anyway, it may not be a huge issue to move everything over to Control Tower where you're creating new accounts if you only have a few existing accounts to migrate. The third use case is if you are part of a company that's undertaking a cloud migration and you've brought consultants in to do it with few or no permanent support staff. If you're part of a consulting company, this is absolutely something I think you should have in your toolbox, because there are a lot of cases where you would come in and do work for a small company where this is exactly the right thing to use. It will allow you to set things up in a way that's very hard for people to break, and a lot of the then sort of low-level tasks like provisioning new accounts, that can all be done by someone just using the console. So we've reached the end of the talk. If you do have any questions about using Control Tower, I'm happy to answer them. I was also contacted by some of the folks at AWS who are interested in whether they might be able to help get people who want to use Control Tower in touch with their solutions architects. So if that's something that you're interested in, if this has piqued your interest and you want some information on how you might use it, then use the QR code on this slide to get yourself in touch with AWS, and they'll put you in contact with a solutions architect who should be able to help. Also, that QR code does have some speaker feedback for me. I don't mind whether you fill that in or not. If you feel so inclined, go ahead. If you don't, then don't. I'm always interested to hear feedback from people, whether it be through that or personally, but whatever you prefer to do is totally fine by me. So that concludes the talk, and I do hope that the information in this talk will at some point allow you to improve your systems by close of business Friday.
Thanks, Don. That was an excellent presentation again. This is the time where everybody who hasn't asked a question yet can quickly do so. Meantime, we have JM to thank for a couple of them. So let's start with those. JM's first question is, does Control Tower support guard duty, or does that need to be installed with CloudFormation?
Admittedly, when I did all of this, I did it the ClickOps version because Control Tower itself does not have programmatic support. But if you want to enable guard duty, you need to do that within guard duty. There's no button in Control Tower that you can click that will allow you to just enable guard duty along with it.
Cool. And then I think a related question. Have you been using the customizations for AWS Control Tower to deploy things like VPCs or Transit Gateway?
Ooh, that was a fun one. I dabbled in it a very tiny bit, trying to work out what the parameters of it were. The issue that I ran up against, and it's something that I highlight in the talk, is Control Tower is really, really bleeding edge. And I have a feeling that in 6 to 12 months, it is going to look very different. And it is not something that I was inclined to look at too much when the solution itself is not particularly mature, because I would generally want to be able to keep doing things that I currently do programmatically. I'd want to be able to keep doing that. And from the little bit that I looked at it, it didn't seem to me that there was as much flexibility in the customizations as I would want.
Yeah. So you mentioned it a bit in the presentation as well, but the inability to do things in a programmatic way using an API or things like that is a bit of a deal breaker for you, isn't it?
I think it's one of those things where, as I said, it really depends on your use case, because I think that there are use cases where this does work, but very mature organizations that tend to lean on being able to do things programmatically a lot, I do not think this is currently a good solution. I anticipate that a lot of the things that I highlighted around being locked into ClickOps and the fact that you can't customize guardrails yourself will be resolved in the next 6 to 12 months. But at the moment, I think that unless you're an immature organization yourself, I think it's just too immature of a solution for me to be able to recommend it to very mature organizations that do a lot of things programmatically. Because your workflow, you're not going to be able to use Control Tower and keep doing what you've been doing with your workflow. Or if you're still doing a lot of the things that you're doing with your workflow, a lot of the effort that you put into setting up Control Tower could probably be better spent elsewhere. And that was my feeling with the customizations. Is I looked at it, and when I played around with it a little bit, I basically thought, look, your effort's probably better spent elsewhere.
That's fair enough. Yep, I can totally understand that. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions crop up. So I guess that means you did an awesome job.
It's always good to be here.
Yep, thank you very much, Don.
No problem. I'm sure I'll be back in a couple of months with the next wild and wonderful thing that I run across.
Yep. Cool. In that case, though, then we will now switch over to our second speaker, Mohan, who will be talking about EKS to us.
Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Mohan. I work as a senior platforms engineer with Belong. I've been working with Kubernetes for almost 3 years now, and with EKS particularly for about a year. I was involved in setting up new EKS clusters, migrating existing workloads from self-managed Kube implementations like Corps to EKS. So I thought I should compile my learnings and thoughts on how to adopt EKS and make it production ready for an enterprise workload. So in this presentation on EKS as a holistic view, I'll be talking about mainly designing EKS clusters, setting up the EKS cluster, hints on how to get things to work, how EKS works with Kubernetes under the hood, and we'll also touch on deployments and updates. Again, each project and each application has its own requirements, so you need to tailor your implementation to fit your needs. I've tried to cover most of the aspects that you need to consider when implementing EKS that I have come across in my experience. Again, a basic understanding of Kubernetes is required for this presentation, and I've included some diagrams to elucidate the points and some interesting pictures on the sides so that you guys are awake. Having said that, let's get started. So EKS, firstly, why EKS? Well, Kubernetes is currently the most popular container management tool. It's cloud agnostic, it's open source, it's battle hardened for production. So many companies are joining the bandwagon to go to Kubernetes. Now, before EKS was launched, people invested a lot of time and effort to install and manage Kubernetes on their AWS workloads and get it right. Now, Kubernetes is complex. So then there were like a lot of tools that were born to help manage Kubernetes, like Corps, Kube AWS, etc. Or I would call them self-managed Kubernetes implementations. But you still had to install these tools yourself, manage them. You had to manage the control plane, the etcd. You had to manage the high availability for your masters, the internal cert upgrades for the internal components. Now EKS has automated this whole control plane management, so you don't have to worry about it. And if you are on AWS and you're going to use EKS, and you're planning to use Kubernetes, or if you're planning to migrate your existing workloads to Kubernetes, EKS is a very good option. Now, with regards to cost, EKS can be a bit expensive, but again, it takes away a lot of your operational costs. It's kind of 10 cents per hour for each EKS cluster that you create. But then you definitely have a lot of operational cost managing the control plane that EKS takes away. Again, EKS is not as AWS specific as ECS. So ECS is AWS' own container management solution, which natively gels well with the AWS constructs. EKS, on the other hand, is Kubernetes running under the hood. So you're going to find a lot of bridges between AWS and Kubernetes that we will look at during the presentation. So I'll walk you through the various steps involved to set up EKS. So first of all, in the design, you consider if you want to go with a multi-tenant or a single tenant architecture. This is basically your workload separation. So do you want to have all your workloads in the same cluster with isolation at different Kubernetes resource levels like namespaces? Or do you want to have a separate cluster for different functional units? Separate clusters makes the management a lot easier, especially with different teams managing different apps. But then it calls for multiple clusters, which means you need to have a unified EKS management process across all your clusters. Then you got to think about what AWS account you're going to install your clusters in, what networking plugin you're going to use. If you're using the default VPC CNI plugin that comes in with EKS, make sure your subnets are big enough, because each pod that you launch consumes an IP address from your subnet. Now, ideally, your workloads would be in the private subnet. and your internet-facing apps would be exposed via load balancers. But again, the subnet design, the VPC design is something that you consider before launching the cluster. One last point is the cluster endpoint access. So by default, when you launch the cluster, the endpoint public access is enabled, which means your cluster API server is accessible from the internet. Now, most companies would want that the cluster is accessible only from your corporate VPN. So you choose the right settings for this cluster endpoint access. So now that you've designed the cluster, you go ahead and launch the cluster. Now, launching the cluster is pretty straightforward. You just choose your automation tool like CloudFormation or Terraform, or EKSCTL. Just create the necessary IAM roles, security groups, access lists, access control lists as recommended by EKS in the documentation. And then you create the EKS nodes. Now we have a couple of options here. EKS recently launched the managed node groups, where they manage the nodes for you, but unfortunately they don't have any support for custom AMIs or user data. So most companies would prefer to go with self-managed nodes, where you can create and manage your own launch config and AMIs. Okay, so now that you've launched your cluster, you got to log in to the cluster. Well, the IAM entity that created the cluster is automatically granted system masters access. So you can log into the cluster, and you're the first ever IAM role to land on this cluster. Now, as you see in the diagram, Kubernetes has its own security constructs, which is the RBAC, which has Kubernetes groups and users tied to namespaces and cluster roles, whereas AWS has its own constructs on IAM, and the AWS auth is the bridge between the AWS and the Kubernetes constructs in this regard. So you got to manage your cluster access for users via IAM on the AWS side. This could be your federated users, your SSO roles, etc. And you have to manage the Kubernetes access for your resources on the Kubernetes side. Just installing the cluster is not enough. There are a lot of add-ons that you need. Some of these come by default. Some of these have to be installed. So it's always a good idea to have a list of all these add-ons that you need to install and automate them, streamline the installation and the upgrade process for various clusters. Next, we look at load balancers and ingress. So this is again the bridge between the AWS load balancers and the Kubernetes service. So you kind of first decide what kind of load balancer you need, and then the technology of the ingress that you want can be Nginx or HA proxy, whatever. You also decide how you manage the load balancer. You can manage the LB from the ingress using annotations. It's good if you want to keep all the config on the Kubernetes side, or you could manage the load balancer using your infra tools like CloudFormation and use node port. Again, you also have to look at all the performance and security settings on the ingress controller, like your tokens to pass, your headers to pass, etc., etc. Then you look at storage. So if your apps are stateless, you're lucky. You can just skip this. But if your apps need storage, you have to design the storage part. So different apps will have different requirements. Some may want to some of them may need block storage. Some of them can use EFS. Again, with block storage, you are locked to an AZ. With EFS, you have to consider your storage size, your performance, IO, etc. The bridge between the AWS and the Kubernetes constructs here is the CSI interface. So you got to manage that, and you got to keep both the sides in sync. Like if you're sizing up your EBS volumes, you got to also size up your PV and your PVCs. Next, we look at IAM roles for applications. So your applications need to talk to resources. Different apps would need to talk to different types of resources, and you need IAM roles. Now, one of the easiest ways is to just use the IAM role attached to the instance. But then that would mean all the apps would get access to all the resources. So, so that calls for fine-grained access. Now, if you've used ECS, you would realize that you can attach IAM roles to tasks, but in EKS, you can't directly attach an IAM role to a pod. So the solution is to create the OIDC identity providers, which act as a bridge between the IAM and the Kubernetes access constructs. So you essentially, like in the diagram, you just create different namespaces and pack your applications that need similar access in the namespaces. And then you attach service accounts to these namespaces, and the service accounts then attach to the IAM roles. So now that you've created the cluster, you've installed the add-ons, taken care of your networking, security, IAM, ingress, and all these things, you want to start hosting your apps. So how do you manage apps? How do you install and upgrade apps? The easiest way is to use kubectl, but then once your apps increase, the complexity increases, your environments increase, and then you need a good app manager like Helm or Customize to keep all your config in place. So one of the lines of thinking is to treat your system apps and your application microservices differently, primarily because system apps don't change that much, and you would also be sharing these across environments, like maybe you have a Prometheus server across all your non-prod environments. And Helm is a good tool for system apps because most of these apps have ready-to-use charts, which you can download and install. For the application microservices, you can choose any tool that your development teams are comfortable with. But again, you got to consider various factors like the complexity of the apps, frequency of the changes, also the repository structure. Do you want to put the kube config along with the app? How are you going to version the kube config, and how the changes are going to be tied to your CI/CD processes? So there's a fair bit of thinking required before you set up the right tools for managing the apps. Then comes secret management. So some people are good at keeping secrets, but some, like Tony Stark, are not really good at keeping secrets. Similarly, some apps can fetch secrets at runtime from your secrets vault. So you just give them necessary IAM access and they're happy. But some of these need Kubernetes secrets. Now these could be third-party apps, so you don't really have control over these. And you'll still have to install your kube secrets. Now kube secrets, as you would know, are base 64 encoded, so there's no such encryption here. So you have to limit the secrets access using the RBAC rules properly. Again, if you are in the AWS ecosystem, you might want to use AWS Secrets Manager because that's easy to use. But then EKS doesn't really integrate natively with Secrets Manager like ECS. So you again need a bridge. You can invest in a third-party broker to integrate your kube secrets with the Secrets Manager, like Kubernetes External Secrets. This is something by GoDaddy, which is pretty good. So yeah, having said that, you've deployed your apps, your functional test pass. Now you're gonna look at scaling for your production loads. Now, as per the EKS documentation, there are 3 types of autoscalers which you can configure. The HPA is mainly for scaling pods within a deployment. Until the latest Kubernetes release, they didn't have support for custom metrics. So you could just scale based on CPU and memory. Kubernetes 1.6 has the support, but I've not really given it a try. The cluster autoscaler is for scaling up your nodes to accommodate more pods. And the vertical autoscaler is for updating the CPU and memory reservations on a pod. Again, I have not really used the vertical autoscaler. I've rather looked at setting up the resource request limits and PDBs for your pods. So now that you're close to production, people start asking where the dashboards, where the centralized logs, etc., etc. So you have to give a close look at logging and monitoring. The control plane logging is pretty good for your audit and diagnosis. For application logs, you would essentially look at log forwarders to ship your container logs to your favorite log management tool. And for monitoring, so the API server in Kubernetes exposes the metrics in Prometheus format. So one of the patterns I've seen is to use Prometheus and Grafana, but then it again calls for maintenance because both these tools need storage and good I/O and stuff. If you are using third-party integrations, you're lucky. You just have to download the New Relic or Datadog or those kind of tools. Integration with Kubernetes. These are basically Helm charts, and then you get all your kube events and alarms on your dashboards. Last but not the least, updates. So EKS releases new versions a few times a year. The two main ways to perform cluster version upgrades. One is an in-place control plane upgrade, and then roll out the new AMIs. Sounds simple, but there's no easy rollback here. And AWS also warns of possible disruptions with this method on this site. So another thing is you could have crucial kube components and add-ons like your kube proxy or something, which may need to upgrade with your kube version. So this is definitely not an option that you would consider for a crucial production cluster. You would go with blue-green, which is more reliable. The other type of update that you would want is an AMI update for node patching. Again, you can use EKS managed nodes if you don't really care about user data or custom AMIs. But if you're using self-managed nodes, you have to invest in a process to roll out new AMIs using your autoscaling groups. Yep. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. Any questions?
Hey, thank you for that. Wasn't expecting that. It ended a little bit quickly. So we had one question come through on the YouTube stream. Hopefully anybody else wants to ask a question. Now is the time. So the question we had come through so far is, where is the button for this? This button. What does the pricing model look like for EKS so far?
Oh, so at the moment on the EKS side, it's like 10 cents per hour for a cluster that you run.
So is that on top of the usage resources, or is that total?
Oh, so this is for the EKS control plane, and then on top of it, you have to pay for your worker nodes stuff.
Okay.
But that's normally EC2 pricing.
Yep. So the 10 cents is just the management charge, basically. Yeah. Yep. How does it compare to trying to run all of this sort of stuff manually?
So again, if you are planning to invest in setting up your own EKS cluster, your Kubernetes cluster, like if you're using Corps or Cube AWS, you would have to set up your masters. You have to take care of the high availability for the masters, certificate upgrades, version updates, etc., etc. So it's a lot of operational cost, in my experience,
Yep.
to set
But
it up,
you
get it
recommend
right.
that the 10-cent charge is pretty reasonable then?
Again, it depends on depends on the company, it depends on the financial model and stuff. But yeah, I mean, if you want to get away from the operational costs and have no headaches with the control plane, you could use EKS. I mean, you'll have to figure it out, your operational cost versus the cost of using EKS and paying for the control plane management.
Yep. We had another question come through. What about the price of EKS compared with ECS?
It's not really compared the pricing models for EKS and ECS. Yeah, I can probably get back to you. I don't really have a comparison as such.
Yep. Yep, that's fair enough. And one more question come through from DM. You mentioned the control plane update on EKS. Is AWS doing a rolling update of the 3 nodes?
So with the control plane, it's just a click. You just go update the control plane, and then you got to roll out the new version for your worker nodes.
Yep.
So as I said, the previous slide, if you're using the EKS managed node groups, EKS will do that for you. So I think it's just creating a new managed group or updating the managed group with the new AMI, and EKS would do that for you. That like EKS would automatically taint your nodes, train your nodes, etc., etc., etc. But then, as I said, there's no user data that you can use there. There's no custom AMI there. If you're using self-managed nodes, you have to take care of this yourself. So you have to roll out a new AMI on your orders or on your order scaling group.
Okay. We had one other question come through. So what are some key reasons why you went from COPS on AWS versus EKS, and were there any challenges?
Oh, the main reason we went was we didn't want to manage the control plane. EKS takes off all that heavy lifting for managing the control plane. So just thought of going to EKS.
Cool. That was awesome. Thank you very much, Mohan.
Yep.
We'll leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much. Okay, so that brings us to the end of another Melbourne AWS user group. Sorry about the technical hiccup there in the middle. My CPU flatlined and the encoder crashed. So yeah, that's something we need to test for next time. Just to wrap up the night then. Our next event is on June 29th. July 29th. Great, I didn't update that slide. Our next event is on July 29th. We won't be here on June 29th. I don't think I could handle 2 of these in a week. That'd be a bit much. Oy. I'd like to thank our sponsors again. I'll probably get rid of that overlay next time, I think. We'd like to thank our sponsors again, Enabler, AC3, CMD, and our new sponsor, Do It International, for their support again for this episode. And finally, we're heading off to the virtual pub. There will be a link posted in Slack in just a moment for a Zoom hangout. Feel free to join us. If not, we'll see you next month. Thanks everybody for watching.